Russia is a nation at war, not just against Ukraine, but the collective West, and the challenges that these two realities have placed on the Russian people, the Russian nation, are immense, and some would say are too big for a nation like Russia to handle. But my report card is that Russia is handling it. The Russian economy is thriving. In many ways, it's stronger than it's ever been, thanks to the sanctions that the United States has placed on Russia and the changes Russia had to make in their economic, in the ways that they pursued the economic. Every city I visited, there was massive construction taking place. There is investment taking place in Russia from abroad, but more importantly, from within. Money that used to flee Russia is now being retained in Russia and being reinvested in Russia. So Russia seems to be a nation that's doing well economically, far better than the West would like it to be. I've also seen a nation united behind their government, behind their nation. The Russia I saw is a very patriotic nation. People rallying to the cause of Russia, and this cause is real. It's a cause that has been, as I said, placed in existential risk by a conflict being waged not by Ukraine but the collective West that seeks the strategic defeat of Russia. And I think what we see is a Russian nation determined not to allow that to happen, and not just to avoid defeat, but to emerge victorious. And how we define victory, how Russia defines victory, is yet to be seen. But Russia is on the path toward victory. Now, today, this optimism might be clouded by things that are happening. People will say, well, wait a minute, aren't there drone strikes against Moscow? Isn't the Ukrainians launching attacks against Belgorod area? And what about this Ukrainian counteroffensive? It appears to have begun. How can you say Russia's doing well when you have all this taking place? These are fair questions, and I couldn't think of a better person to discuss these questions than our guest today, Alexander Mikhailov, Bureau of Military Political Affairs, an experienced Russian specialist, a politician, and a man who has his finger on the pulse of all things Russia. So, Alexander, I want to thank you for coming here today.
Thank you a lot for great words, Scott, that you have said about our country. It has been a pleasure to listen to such words from the American citizens. It's, a rare case when we listen to such frank words about our country, particularly over the recent years. At the same time, I would agree with you that we represent two biggest missile and nuclear powers in the strategic dialogue, which has been the case over the last couple of decades, provided for at least certainty on our planet. And the people, not only the citizens of both our countries, but the citizens of other dozens of states, were not afraid to be awakened by a nuclear Armageddon. Right now the situation is, and that's the social networks demonstrate, and the people who demonstrate voting for the peace between the East and the West, which will give only the positive and benefits to all the stakeholders in this dialogue. So let's follow the situation. Unfortunately, right now in Russia, and you were right to mention that in regions of Bryansk, Belgorod and Kursk regions, which have direct borderline with Ukraine, a very, very unfavorable military situation, Russia is not conducting offensive on Ukrainian borderline. Now it is in retreat, but the adversary is using both air and heavy artillery systems. The defenders of this borderline saw in South Donetsk Leopard tanks. It was the first time, and there is evidence from the people on the front lines of the Ukrainian army is using German tanks which were supplied to Ukraine from Europe. So far, we don't see many of them just some spots. But the dialogue which happened in November concerning the Leopard, now it's June, and we already witness Leopard in operation on the borderline. So it's not the speed what the Ukrainians were expected to get these heavy systems, but it is in war conflict against Russian group. The situation is not very easy. I'm constantly getting information from Shebekin at Belgorod region and from different spots on the borderline and on the front line in Kherson region, in South Donetsk region, in Makiivka in Donetsk region. There is still shelling going on. So we're following the situation, Scott.
No, it's war is. The people speak of the fog of war. We hear that in everybody, and especially early on in something. There's a lot of information out there, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of in some cases concern, even fear about what's transpiring. But I think we can agree that, as you indicated, the initial discussions about the Leopard began last October, November, and they're just now appearing on the battlefield. So I think we can agree that none of this has taken the Russian government or the Russian military by surprise, that this is something that has been anticipated. And while the Ukrainians can achieve localized surprise, localized success, that strategically Russia should be in a position to absorb the Ukrainian blows and retain its a superior military posture on the battlefield. Do you share my optimism, or do you have reason to believe otherwise?
I do believe that right now the Ukrainian forces need to demonstrate not only the determination or military success, but they need to report to Washington, to Brussels, to London for the billion of US dollars and euros spent not on the economy of the Ukraine but in military machine of Ukraine. Of course, people in the street got nothing. They got armory, weapons, and the weapons which is used not only against the adversary and the peaceful civilians of the Ukrainians, just citizens, are the hostage of the Ukrainian regime, which allow the West countries to pump this area with the weapons and to give all the support, the political support to those activities that Ukraine is conducting against Russian borders. I would like to reiterate that according to the Russian doctrine, when our sovereign territory is attacked, Russia has the right to use all the military capabilities possible, including the strategic nuclear weapons. Ukraine is acting on a thin line, and there is a propaganda that the Russian Liberation Army is penetrating the Russian territory, and we see even the mercenaries from Poland, from Europe, and the Ukrainian reserve troops which are deployed there, and they are shelling and they take their hit squads inside the Russian territory. But in foreign policy and what we see in the West mass media, they are talking about kind of guerrilla liberation army or movement. It's nonsense. It's a very dangerous play. Those people who take control of that are walking on a thin line, on a thin ice, because if there is a big attack on Russian territory, is going to be all the military means necessary. Probably that's what the Washington needs, because Europe doesn't need it at all. If there is a stake on a long-term campaign to defeat Russia, I can understand that, but I don't understand why these European countries need that. If there is a nuclear cloud, it's going to move towards Europe, and this territory cannot support life. So why is this escalation happening? It's one thing when Russia is liberating 4 regions in Donbass, included in the Russian territory, and there is a military conflict, but there is a territory of Russia which has always been the Russian territory, even before the collapse of the USSR, even during the Tsar, the monarchy time of Russian Empire, that was sovereign part of Russia. And now, what it can end up in a big campaign against Ukraine, or this decision-making centers attack from Russia or a serious escalation at the level of the against the collective West, or what is going to happen? I believe that the parties supporting this attack against Belgorod region are there, playing with fire. It's a very dangerous case. So we need to differentiate between the military action on Donbas region and attempts to shell Russian territory using foreign mercenaries and foreign arms. What do Poles have to do with the Belgorod region? What do they have that? But they have their broadcasts, these Polish broadcasts, and they demonstrate a direct involvement in the military conflict against Russian citizens, as they killed and injured, wounded people of Belgorod rural areas have nothing to do with the war conflict in Ukraine. It's a very dangerous case. We need to get back to our sense. European leaders need to get back to their sense, to remember the Ukrainian regime, to read the doctrine of Russian security. All the threats and risks are stipulated quite clearly. The Europe and America providing all the capabilities, fuel, material support of the Ukrainian army. So we will have to bomb and attack this borderline of Ukraine and Europe if the escalation doesn't stop.
Well, you bring up an interesting point. To what end is this conflict being waged? If you listen to Victoria Nuland, if you listen to Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, and even people like Borrell and van der Leyen in Europe, it appears that this Ukrainian counteroffensive is designed to break the spirit of Russia, to drive Russia to accept a negotiated conclusion to this conflict that is to the advantage of Ukraine. So the idea is that they're putting all of their eggs in one basket, so to speak, this counteroffensive, the attack against Belgorod. It's not just to shape the battlefield militarily, but to shape it politically, to achieve a political result in Russia, to break the spirit of the Russian people and bring down the Russian government. Does this have any chance of success? Do you perceive any weakness on the part of Russia where, Ukrainian counteroffensive can compel Russia to agree to a negotiation of this conflict in ways that would require Russia, for instance, to give up Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia? Or is this just wishful thinking on the part of the Ukrainians and their Western supporters?
On the other side of the front line, there is a legend, there is a myth, which is connected with the World War I, 1917, when the historical event, the Russian army reversed and went back to remove the authorities which had sent that. And there was a revolution, there was a civil war. So the war was a kind of a catalyst of the coup d'etat and regime change in 1917. Of course, that's what the Ukrainians, the leaders in Ukraine want, and the decision-making centers of the West, collective West, want, for such. It's not quite clear. There need to be a panic, forcing people to go outside and to effect a coup d'etat. But it will not be the case. You have visited Russia, and you have seen the patriotic society of Russia. Of course, we do have our own people oriented at the West. From 1 to 2 million people have left Russia after the beginning of the special military operation. But Russia hasn't diminished, it hasn't weakened. From a perspective in our society, it's much cleaner. There is a kind of collective determination to win. And our victory is not over anything. The victory of Russia is to give an opportunity to the Russian-speaking people to live in their homeland and in good interaction with their neighbors. You know, to be honest, I do remember 1990s, and I don't understand how European leaders could agree to be a weapon in the hands of the Washington. Let's be honest, they are not sovereign in their political decisions, and they transferred the agenda to the hands of the elite, which can be seen right now in the White House in Washington. I don't understand the interest of Washington, since Washington is a hegemon state and it wants to still dominate the world, and even Europe can be regarded as adversary in the economic field. So the war in Ukraine allows, kneeling down the European competitors and to bring great benefit from that. At the same time, the European leaders themselves need to explain to Washington that they have the right to say a word, and that we have to live with this crazy neighbor, a country full of weapons, a big outflow of people from Ukraine. There is a big criminalization in Ukraine. There is no rule of law. It is absolutely corrupted state where the rule of law doesn't operate, where absolutely different internal forces are in action, both by Zelensky and other internal actors. Ukraine is governed by oligarchs, the capitalists, who govern the internal political situation quite manually. And I would like to reiterate that in 9 months in 2024, the election is going to happen, the presidential election is going to happen. No, it's not going to be the case. They're not going to cancel the election. Washington will not allow Zelensky not to conduct the presidential election. Now we are going to have a new stage of pumping the Ukrainian with political models and different statements. We will see a big clash between the domestic political groups. I believe that even until the election, Zelensky cannot be the president anymore. It might be the way of how to hide Zelensky from retribution. So he can take his post till March, and then he will go to London and to the United States whenever he's accepted, actually. From my perspective, you cannot rule it out, because this election campaign is going to determine the balance of powers, and the strife for the victory by particular clans in Ukraine will put a strain and pressure on the governing elite of Zelensky.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because people talk about what is Russia's end game, what defines victory for Russia? And you've said victory is the defense of the Russian-speaking people. Vladimir Putin, when he spoke a few months ago, he didn't speak about a Russian offensive to capture Odessa. He didn't speak about a Russian offensive to capture Kharkov or to threaten Kiev. He spoke about creating the conditions for the economic and social well-being of the Russians that are in the territories that have been absorbed by Russia. So that appears to be the goal. There's a lot of people who say that this war can't end until Russia captures Odessa. But I don't hear the Russian government saying that. And what you've said is something very interesting, that, because we speak of, also the Russian government has spoken of denazification as a goal, how to get rid of the Zelensky regime. Is a Russian goal to create the conditions for democratic change in Ukraine, that Ukraine would cleanse itself through a political process that would delegitimize Zelensky and put in place somebody who would be willing to live peacefully with Russia? Is this something that the Russian government is looking to? You're the first person I've heard who's in a position of authority and knowledge to bring up the March election as a critical event. Is this something that the West should be looking at, that this is a decision point, that the March election could be a key event that allows the transition of Ukraine away from war towards peace?
Yes, because Ukrainian case is becoming very important and determining from the prospect for the election in the US. Next year, we're going to see the election in the United States. So there are going to be a lot of questions about Ukraine to Biden, and quite severe questions if he runs for the president from the Democrats. Secondly, money. It's all about money, about the billion of pumping into Ukraine. It is a big headache not only in the West. It's a big headache for just regular citizens. I'm constantly reading European and American social networks on different political chats, and I see a very interesting trend. A year ago, around 80-90% of the users of the social network supported these financial aids, and it was clear where the money was invested in. It was not about the social support that was pumped into the military machine, war machine, but over the recent months, I've been witnessing an absolutely different picture. So the shift to the situation where people keep on asking, and the money spent on the weapons, can they bring to any peace? So as the weapons brought to this territory, how can it bring peace? It's absolutely nonsense. So you need to relieve the territory from the weapons and maybe to give control over the state under the international platform. I'd like to reiterate the president's, Mr. Putin's statement during the first months of the operation. Russia is not going to occupy Ukraine. That's not the end goal. That's not the end game for Russia. And Russia has enough